This is another look at the Writer's Craft pilot. In this case, what we're doing is talk about combining subplots. So the goal of this little lesson today is to weave multiple storylines together into a single show. It's important to remember that the pilot is, of course, a single show. It's a single idea, but it's actually made up of many different stories. In some cases, if you really look closely, you can see 5, 6, 7 subplots. But I'm going to ask you to use about 5 subplots in your pilot. I talked about the importance of a dynamic plot, taking a single story idea and turning it into a dynamic plot. We looked at examples from Community, at an example from Seinfeld, and I asked you guys to think about 4 stages in the plot that would make it dynamic. For example, the trigger is the moment that initiates the conflict of the plot. If you think about a certain story idea, there is an inherent conflict in that story idea, and the trigger is the moment that initiates that story idea. So in a typical story, the conflict moves towards a climax, but it begins with a moment. If you look at a lot of films, stage plays, or really any kind of a story, things happen in the process of reaching the climax that actually intensify the drama. We would call these crises. So the trigger begins the conflict. The first crisis makes it worse, and the second crisis makes it even worse. So that by the time the climax happens, the tension is tightened so intensely that the reader or the audience is fully engaged. What I wanted to do is take a look at a story from The Sopranos pilot, which I would call Tony, Dr. Melfi, and the Ducks from Canada. In the pilot, if you look at it, there's a lot of things going on, but this is only one of the stories. I think it's actually probably the most important story. The premise of the story is that Tony is raising a duck family in his pool, but cannot stop the ducks from leaving when they finally decide to leave. This actually promotes a crisis for Tony, and it dogs him and haunts him throughout the episode, and it nags at his soul. So the trigger moment is when Tony enters the pool and begins to talk about the ducks and talk to the ducks. The ducklings start to try to fly, which excites him, but which his family doesn't seem to care about. That's actually an important moment in the story. It's hard when you see the whole pilot together. It's a single scene in 35 scenes or so, but it's the trigger moment of one plot. And so, well, why is this trigger important? Why is this the trigger? I think it's the moment in which Tony realizes that he has some sort of internal prompting of his soul, which puts him at odds with the world around him. It's not just that his family doesn't understand this, but his world doesn't understand this. It turns out that the whole issue with the ducks is really that the ducks are for him a metaphor of his family, and he loves his family, but he is somehow unable to communicate that, and he's terrified of losing his family. So the next moment, which is what I would call the first crisis, happens at his son Tony Jr.'s birthday party, and it's triggered by the ducks flying away, leaving him at the pool. Now this is kind of important because it's triggered by the ducks, but there's all these other things going on in the scene that mean that the ducks flying away are not just ducks flying. Ducks aren't just ducks. The ducks are really his family, and his son having a birthday, growing up, maybe he's going to fly away, that kind of thing. So Tony has this physical breakdown that indicates his inability to really understand this and also to do anything about it. It's prompted, I think, by a sense of powerlessness. So the climactic moment is another scene with Dr. Melfi, where Melfi helps Tony see the connection between the ducks and his fear of losing his family. And it's a climactic moment because he reaches a breakthrough. And you can see that this is symbolized by his tears. So it's another scene in the office. They barely have to do what we're doing right now because they've done it so many times. They have a single idea in their head, and they just write with that idea. If you've never done this before, I think that it's difficult to do it without planning. So now I want to move on to the planning stage. When I look at a typical TV show, we can see that it's really a long and complex series of scenes. I could take the Game of Thrones and break it down into scenes. If I made a chart, I could say that The story begins with scene one and things happen, scene two, scene three, and so on. It turns out that the pilot for the Game of Thrones, it's 100 minutes long, is broken into 23 scenes. We can take a look at Downton Abbey, same thing. There's a scene in which action takes place, and it's a linear show. Things happen from beginning to middle to end. Same thing with the House of Cards. There's a scene, there's the action, and it all flows together. I've done this also with The Sopranos. It begins at scene one. The duck scene happens very early on in the show. That's scene two. And then the show progresses, and it's 32 scenes long. A typical show progresses in a linear fashion, and all of the plots are woven together. So these subplots that are involved with The Sopranos, the ducks from Canada, Tony and his mother, Tony and his nephew, Tony and his uncle, these different subplots together, they are woven together. And we don't just have the first plot dealt with. It jumps from plot 1 to plot 6 to plot 3 and 8 to plot 4, 5, and 9 to plot 4 and 2, 2 and 1, 1 and 7, 3 and 9. It's not that it deals with each of these plots consecutively. Rather, it deals with them concurrently. So how do we weave them together? So I think that a show can be broken down into a list of concurrent scenes. So if you take a look at the Game of Thrones, for example, it begins with one plot. Plot that we're looking at here is the plot dealing with the Night Walkers north of the Wall in the Northland north of Winterfell. And Night Watch enters the wild north of the Wall. They encounter a slaughtered wildling village and then are killed by the others. Then there's credits, and then right away, with the third and fourth scenes, the other plots are engaged. I now think that it's better to think about how each of those dynamically developed plots can be engaged in your stories. If I were to look at the Sopranos plot in this way, I would not see it as a linear development. I would see it as a concurrent development. I can show the story unfolding as a linear way, which is how we see it when we watch it. But I think when you are planning it, what you need to do is put all the subplots together side by side concurrently. So we can see that there are a lot of different stories being told. There's not only the story about the ducks, but also what I would call mothers and sons, the relationship between Tony and his mother Livia, the nephew, the uncle, mothers and daughters, the marriage subplot between Tony and his wife, the whole issue of declining respect, shrinking of Tony's criminal empire, and then the incursions of new rival immigrant groups. check gang is appearing. So these are all plots that I came up with. So that is not that hard. Thinking of the 5 stories that you want to tell, what I want you to do is to dynamically plan those stories. So each of these stories, I think, has a trigger. Each one has first crisis. Most of them have a second crisis. And they're all climactically resolved, mostly, except for Tony and his mother. But in fact, when I actually look at it, I realize that Tony and his mother is going to be a problem later on because his mother starts to scheme with his uncle. This may be a part of a wider subplot that involves Tony's uncle and Tony's mother, and they're sort of the older generation is kind of scheming up. So to do this with your own story, take all 5 plots and plot them together on this chart. I've included a planning chart. It doesn't look like much here, but you can see how it might look if you really, went to town with it. I don't even know if the writing room at The Sopranos or the headliner wrote a chart like this before he started writing the pilot, or whether he just wrote it in one kind of consecutive way. But I want you to try to do this with this. So what are your plots? What would you call them? What's the premise of the plot? And what are the moments in the plots where the premise is triggered? And how do you amp up the action? And how do you want this whole thing to be climactically resolved? Then what you can do is think of the events of the story that dynamically plan your story, and what is the order of the moments that you would like to choose in the telling of your story. So how do you order them? Once you've filled out this chart, in what order do you want these events to happen? So typically you would want to engage the trigger first, and then the first crisis, and the second crisis, and at the end of the show you want the whole climax to be resolved. In the case of The Sopranos, all these plots are probably being wrapped up in the last couple of scenes. Is you want to build toward a climax. And you can decide the order. So what I did is I looked over the show and I tried to identify the order in which these scenes happen. It seems to me that the first 8 scenes are all trigger events. There's the first scene. First one, Tony goes into the pool. The second one, Carmela is hinting at his affairs. The third scene, Hunter invites Meadow to Aspen. In the fourth scene, Tony is not impressed with his nephew. In the fifth scene, he beats up Mahaffey. In the sixth scene, Uncle Junior, has announced that he wants to kill someone in Artie Bucco's restaurant. And then in the seventh scene, they talk about Kohler brothers coming in to undercut Tony's garbage services. And then finally, the eighth scene, Tony visits his mother. All of these subplots are actually engaged in the first 8 scenes. It's a complicated process. And then in the next 7 or 8 scenes or so, each plot is revisited again. And it's not that a single scene has to include only one plot. Some scenes include many plots. Each scene has like 2 or 3 plots that are addressed. And I think that's pretty normal. So when you do this chart, you might think of a moment that addresses that dynamic stage of your plot. But when you actually come to writing your screenplay, you might actually include several of these moments in one scene. And that's going to be something that we talk about when we look at how to write a scene. But I think this planning is really important. That shows like The Sopranos, like the Game of Thrones, Downton Abbey, and all these other TV shows are really brilliant. And it's not just because of the acting or the cinematography, costumes. I think primarily because of the writing, and I think the writing is good primarily because of the planning. So I just want to urge you once again to really try to finish this chart up. Do a good job. Put at least one point in each of these stages and try to think about, the whole geography, the whole landscape of the story that you want to tell. Anyway, we'll talk later. So, yeah, thanks, guys.